The story you're about to hear is an absolutely true story. I had heard this story many times. It involves the Pacific Northwest smoke jumpers, which are men and women that jump out of airplanes into remote locations in order to fight wildfires. Yeah, pretty badass. At any rate, I had heard this story and I had read this story in a publication called Bigfoot Terror in the Woods, a book series written by W.J. Sheehan, Volume 1, Chapter 20. But it wasn't until one of my subscribers hit me up and said, Richie, I was actually there. She was a female smoke jumper, and she said, this story is absolutely true. So you're going to want to sit back, you're going to want to relax, and you're going to want to check this out. Before we get started, make sure you hit that subscribe button as well as the notification and leave a comment below. Here we go. Our story starts off with a young fella named Ronald Johnston, your average American living in the 60s and 70s that was sent over to Vietnam. Now, Ronald did 2 tours in Vietnam, which is a tough thing to do, but he did it. And much like most of his comrades, he was very disconcerted when the war suddenly stopped. Many of these guys volunteered to do a second tour. My father actually did that. And they weren't allowed to win this war. It was like fighting a fight with one hand tied behind your back. And then suddenly you get the memo that, hey, by the way, the war's over. We're out of here. Boom. Everybody that was able to get shipped home was shipped home. But sadly, many good men were left there in the jungles of Vietnam. And when he returned home, like many Vietnam soldier, he was very disillusioned. He found himself in barrooms, and he found himself indulging in the new nightlife, we'll call it. Ronald was still in very good shape from his military years, but he was highly disillusioned and was rudderless. He didn't know which way to turn. So again, alcohol and drugs filled the void. Until one day he was at the barber shop. And while waiting his turn to get his hair cut and a shave, he noticed a magazine cover that featured smoke jumpers on it. And right when he saw that, he knew that was the type of thing he wanted to do. He had already done airborne in the military, and the camaraderie shown in these guys was something that he was severely lacking. So this was the direction that he went. So now I'm going to read you the story exactly as he reported it to the author of the book that I mentioned previously. After trying to recall the 70s, it was all a blur. Mentally and physically, I was shot, having left it all on the battlefield. I was as lost as a soul can be. I found myself drinking and smoking pot heavily. This went on for most of the 70s. But around 1979, I moved to Lake Tahoe. Looking for a fresh shot at life while waiting in a barbershop, I noticed a magazine cover with smoke jumpers on it. And this resonated with me. The men arm in arm, their face covered with soot, the camaraderie, etc. As I looked at the smoke-covered faces of the men, I knew I found my path. I started to train relentlessly, still being in fairly good shape, and I had a huge advantage to this newfound goal. Thanks to my military training, I was a certified field medic as well as several hundred parachute jumps. Thanks to my drive and my military attributes, I was welcomed into a fire jumper squad in the Pacific Northwest. Fire jumping can be very dangerous. For example, we are dropped into the path of a fire with supplies and gear to try and create fire breaks to disrupt the path of the fire. And if we've done our job properly, the fire will run out of fuel and burn itself out. Fire jumping can be a very lonely deal. We must be attentive to the advancing fires at all times. In many situations, the only help we can rely on is air support and ourselves, though in some cases we can receive ground support if the situation allows. Many times it is common to see wildlife fleeing ahead of the incoming fire. Herds of deer or wild horses can be seen running for cover, trying to escape the smoke and the flames. One day in August, a lightning strike started a fire in Northern California. There was already 5,000 acres burning when we got the call. We began to work an adjacent hillside opposite the most intense area of burn to try and create a fire break. Felling trees and clearing out the underbrush, we were trying to starve the incoming blaze of fuel. We worked this area for hours before the team leader made the decision that we should climb the hillside and work our way down to a canyon area to our west. The theory being was that if the fire advanced in the direction of the canyon, it would either burn out by the edge or burn down into it, making it easier to contain. Everything in this business is a gamble of what ifs. This is where it gets crazy. As we began our descent, we noticed a line of creatures walking away from the canyon and heading north, walking along like men. They were black in color. One of our team members pulled out her binoculars and said that they were Bigfoot. We couldn't believe it, but we all took a turn looking through our binoculars and saw it plain as day for ourselves. There were 3 large Bigfoots and 1 smaller one fleeing from the smoke and impending fire, like all the other forest creatures. But we had no time to continue watching them as we had a fire to deal with. But we sure did have plenty to talk about. As we made our way to the bottom of the canyon, forming a line as was always the case, Steve Mays and I were closest to the canyon's outcropping. The 2 of us occupying the area the Bigfoot just moved through. About 2 hours into it, Steve said, "Oh my God, what the hell is that, Ron?" It's a person, or what's left of them anyway. We had come across the remains of a person or what was left of them. We laid down our tools and called the rest of the team. We all stood there looking at the skeletal remains of a person still wearing clothes. The clothes were weather-beaten and clinging to the skeleton. Clearly, the skeleton had been here a long time and was wedged between 2 large boulders. As we all stood there looking at this skeleton, we all realized something wasn't right. Something was wrong with the clothes. The skeleton had a collared shirt, and according to the direction the boots were facing, these clothes were on backwards. And after a minute, someone pointed out the shoes were on the wrong feet. Also, the entire skeleton was there, but there was no skull present. We wondered to ourselves, who the hell would hike through this area with their shirt on backwards and their shoes on the wrong feet? There wasn't a backpack or any other gear present with the corpse, only the remains of a blue shirt and a pair of tan trousers and brown hiking boots. And there were no socks or underwear visible. We started wondering if the clothes and shoes had been removed at some point in time, but wondered who or what wouldn't have known how to properly put the clothes back on in the correct manner. If you're going to go through the trouble of dressing a dead man, wouldn't you at least do it right? Because it's actually easier to dress them correctly. We all agreed not to touch the remains too much, though we did search for ID, finding none. We all knew this body didn't just drop dead here on its own, as it was clearly killed, then jammed between the boulders. And it didn't get dragged here either, by someone or something. We also knew carrying out this body without an investigation was not going to fly. At the very least, however, given the fire and our current situation, there was no help in sight. As a matter of fact, the entire area could be consumed by fire in the next couple of days. We radioed our situation to command, and we continued to battle the fire for the next 10 days. At some point, we hooked up with ground support in order to relay the body's location. About a week later, a group of us went back into the canyon with the law enforcement officials, discovered that the fire had actually spared this area. We had come back in with a couple of stump jumpers, which are seriously beefy off-road fire trucks. The sheriff's department was treating this as a full-blown crime scene. They said the clothes being on backwards was something they had seen many other times over the years. Some thought it was the MO of a mad serial killer. But after that day, we hadn't heard anything more on this dead body ever again. Now, Ronald started to describe the Bigfoots. The walk and the size of these creatures was inhuman. Their walk and steps had very wide spacings, and their upper bodies had a forward lean to them. In third, their arms were very long, and when they turned their upper body, their arms would flail outward. Now, that's the end of the story as it was reported. But my subscriber, who claims she was there and gave me her credentials that back up her story, but sadly, because of the world that we live in, she doesn't want to get ridiculed and lose her job. But it's not too hard to figure out who it is, just saying. But she said the law enforcement officers, the sheriff's department, and the rangers all said this looks like the work of the big guys. And when they questioned them on that, they simply pointed to their feet and then said big, meaning Bigfoot. Stories about Bigfoots attacking and killing people that cross into their territory, etc., are quite common, and it usually ends up with somebody missing an arm, a leg, a skull, and their clothes are either put down next to their body or put back on them improperly. It's a strange thing, but it is what it is. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this story. Make sure you hit that like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below, and I will try to return the favor. I am out.